Daniel could have married into real money instead of dragging home some retired schoolteacher, my daughter-in-law's mother whispered while staring directly at my thrift store coat. I smiled and pretended not to hear her. The truth was, people rarely show you who they are when they think you're powerful. They show you exactly who they are when they believe you have nothing to offer them. I learned that lesson a long time ago, and that was exactly why I arrived at the Carter family's country club wearing a pair of old beige flats and carrying a faded leather purse that looked older than my granddaughter's piano teacher. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened that night changed the way I looked at my own son forever. The country club sat on the edge of Lake Wisteria, about 40 miles outside Chicago. The kind of place where every window gleamed, every hedge was trimmed with military precision, and every woman over 50 somehow looked untouched by time. I parked my 12-year-old Buick between two glossy black SUVs and turned off the engine slowly. For a moment, I just sat there with my hands folded over the steering wheel. My reflection stared back at me through the windshield. Silver hair pinned neatly back. Soft cream cardigan. No jewelry except my wedding band and a tiny pair of pearl earrings. Harold used to tease me for those earrings. "Ellie," he'd say, "you own enough property to buy this whole county and you still dress like a librarian from 1987. I smiled at the memory, though the ache behind it never truly disappeared. Harold had been gone for almost 4 years now. 4 years since the heart attack took him while he was watering the hydrangeas behind our Florida property. 4 years since lawyers started calling me principal owner and majority shareholder. 4 years of pretending I was far less wealthy than I actually was. That last part had been Harold's idea. Money changes how people love you, he told me once while we sat on our balcony overlooking the Gulf Coast sunset. Sometimes it changes whether they love you at all. At the time I thought he was cynical. Now I understood he was careful. Very careful. I stepped out of the Buick and immediately noticed Patricia Carter watching me through the country club entrance windows. Even from 50 feet away, I could see her eyes flick down toward my shoes. Then came the smile. Tight, polite, disappointed. I'd seen that smile before. Usually from people who assumed kindness was weakness. Daniel greeted me at the entrance with a quick hug that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and stress. "Mom, you made it," he said, though his tone sounded more relieved than happy. "Traffic wasn't too bad?" "Not once I got off the interstate," I replied softly. Vanessa appeared beside him almost instantly, beautiful as always in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill back when I actually lived on a teacher's pension. She kissed my cheek lightly. "Eleanor, you look sweet." Sweet. Not elegant. Not lovely. Sweet was the word women like Vanessa used when they wanted to compliment you without actually raising your value in the room. "Thank you, dear," I said. Her eyes drifted briefly toward my purse before she linked her arm through Daniel's. Tiny gestures reveal more than words ever do. Inside, the dining room glittered with crystal chandeliers and polished silverware. A pianist played softly in the corner while waiters moved through the room carrying trays of wine and tiny crab cakes. Patricia Carter stood near the fireplace wearing white slacks and enough diamonds to blind a pilot. Beside her was her husband Leonard, tall and red-faced, with the stiff smile of a man who practiced looking successful in mirrors. "So this is Daniel's mother," Patricia said as if she were inspecting an item she might return to a store. She air-kissed the air beside my cheek. "Vanessa has told us so much about you." I doubted that very much. Leonard shook my hand with 2 fingers. "Daniel says you taught elementary school?" "3rd grade for 32 years, I answered. "Must have been rewarding," he said in the same tone people use when discussing volunteer work. "I imagine retirement income from teaching isn't exactly luxurious these days." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. Vanessa quickly picked up a champagne glass from a passing waiter and handed it to her mother, steering the conversation elsewhere before it became too obvious. But I noticed everything. I always notice everything. We sat down for dinner 20 minutes later. Patricia made a performance out of discussing their recent vacation in Tuscany. Leonard talked about golf memberships and investment opportunities. Vanessa chimed in about a designer renovation she and Daniel planned for their condo downtown. My son mostly stayed quiet, nodding along, occasionally glancing toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read anymore. Embarrassment, perhaps. Or guilt. Maybe both. And what do you do these days, Eleanor? Patricia finally asked while slicing into her sea bass. I keep busy enough, I said with a small smile. I garden, read, volunteer at the church pantry twice a week. Patricia tilted her head sympathetically. That's lovely. Simple pleasures matter at your age. At your age. Another tiny knife wrapped in lace. I took a sip of water instead of responding. People become reckless when they think you're beneath them. That's the dangerous thing about arrogance. It blinds people to who's quietly observing them. Halfway through dinner, Leonard leaned back in his chair and asked Daniel, "So when are you finally convincing your mother to downsize?" Daniel laughed nervously. "We've talked about senior communities a little." Patricia nodded immediately. Honestly, it's the smart move. Big homes become impossible for older women to manage alone. Older women. Alone. As if I were already fading into irrelevance right there at the dinner table. Vanessa reached over and squeezed Daniel's hand. "We just worry about her," she said softly. "Family should take care of each other." There it was. The line rehearsed to sound compassionate. I smiled into my wineglass before anyone noticed the coldness that passed through my eyes. Because at that exact moment I finally understood something important. They weren't assessing me socially. They were assessing me financially. Measuring weakness. Estimating usefulness. Looking for access points. Harold had once told me wealthy predators rarely look dangerous at first. Sometimes they wear pearls and offer dessert menus. After dinner, Vanessa suggested we all step outside to see the lake view from the terrace. I deliberately left my purse hanging on the back of my chair. 10 minutes later, while everyone admired the water and Patricia loudly criticized another woman's cosmetic surgery, I quietly slipped back inside to retrieve it. The dining room was mostly empty now. Candlelight flickered against the polished windows. I was only a few feet from the table when I heard Patricia's voice drifting from the hallway near the bar. "Honestly, Vanessa, thank God Daniel's ambitious. Because his mother certainly doesn't have much to contribute." They laughed softly. Then Leonard spoke. "Does the old woman even own that little house outright?" Vanessa answered next. Calm. Amused. Careless. "Oh, Daniel thinks she's comfortable. But trust me, she's exactly what she looks like. Poor, lonely, and completely naive." My hand tightened around the strap of my purse. "Once Daniel gets control of things later on," Patricia added, "you'll finally have the lifestyle you deserve." Vanessa laughed quietly. "That's the plan." I stood there in complete silence while the chandelier light shimmered across the marble floor beneath my feet. Poor. Lonely. Naive. They truly believed every word of it. And for the first time all evening I almost smiled for real. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, with thin rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows while I stood at the stove making oatmeal I did not really want to eat. There is something strange about betrayal when it first settles into your life. The world keeps moving exactly as it always has. Coffee still brews. Birds still gather near the porch railing. Mail still arrives at noon sharp. Meanwhile, somewhere underneath those ordinary moments, your understanding of people begins shifting inch by inch until nothing feels quite stable anymore. I carried my bowl to the small breakfast table beside the window and watched fog drift across the lake. Harold used to call mornings like this thinking weather. The kind of weather that forced people indoors with their own thoughts. My phone buzzed beside the sugar bowl. Vanessa. I stared at her name for a moment before answering. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said brightly. Too brightly. "I hope we did not keep you out too late last night." Her voice sounded polished as always. Warm on the surface. Empty underneath. "I slept fine," I replied gently. "Good. I was actually calling because Patricia thought it might be nice if we all had brunch Sunday at our house." I stirred my oatmeal slowly though it had already gone cold. "That sounds lovely. Perfect. Daniel misses you." Another carefully placed sentence. Like someone arranging flowers in a room with a gas leak and pretending nothing dangerous is happening underneath. "Tell him I am looking forward to it," I said softly. After we hung up, I remained seated at the table long after the rain stopped. Then finally I rose, washed the untouched bowl in the sink, and walked upstairs to my bedroom. The closet stretched nearly the length of the wall, though only half of it contained clothes I actually wore. Near the back hung dresses worth thousands of dollars still wrapped in protective covers from charity galas and business events Harold once insisted I attend. Beside them sat designer handbags I had not touched in years. Diamond necklaces locked in velvet cases. Silk gowns. Tailored coats from New York boutiques Patricia Carter would probably recognize instantly. I looked at them for a long moment before reaching instead for an old gray sweater with tiny pills along the sleeves. Then I chose faded slacks and practical walking shoes. The performance mattered now more than ever. Because once people become convinced they understand your value, they stop hiding their intentions. By noon, I drove into town for groceries at the little market near St. Anne's Church. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while old country music drifted softly through the aisles. Mrs. Harper from the flower shop waved at me near the produce section. "Morning, Eleanor. You staying dry out there by the lake?" "Trying my best," I answered with a smile. Simple conversations. Familiar faces. People who knew me as the retired widow who volunteered at food drives. And tipped waitresses too much at the diner. I preferred it that way. Wealth can build walls around your life before you even notice they are there. Near the dairy aisle, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Martin. "I received another alert this morning," he said without preamble. Leonard Carter's consulting company requested records connected to Whitmore Coastal Holdings. I stopped pushing the grocery cart. "That company is buried 3 layers deep under the trust." "Exactly," Martin replied quietly. "Which means somebody is getting more aggressive with their digging." I looked around the grocery store slowly. A young mother comparing yogurt brands. 2 elderly men arguing about baseball near frozen foods. Normal life continuing untouched around me. "Can they access anything?" I asked softly. "Not without your authorization." "But Eleanor." He paused briefly. "People searching that hard usually believe there is something very valuable to find." After the call ended, I finished shopping carefully, though my thoughts remained elsewhere. By the time I returned home, the clouds had broken apart and pale sunlight shimmered across the lake. I carried groceries inside and nearly missed the envelope resting beneath my front door. No stamp. Hand-delivered. My stomach tightened immediately. Inside was a glossy brochure for an upscale senior living community about 30 miles away. Golden Meadows Luxury Retirement Estates. Smiling gray-haired couples walked through manicured gardens beneath elegant lettering. Attached to the front was a yellow sticky note written in Vanessa's careful handwriting. "Just something for you to consider long-term. We only want what is best for you." I stood motionless in the kitchen holding the brochure while afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. Then very slowly I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so transparent. The timing alone revealed everything. They were preparing the narrative already. Elderly widow. Too isolated. Needs assistance. Should downsize. The brochure joined a growing pile of evidence Harold once warned me people reveal willingly when they think they are being clever. That evening I drove to the cemetery just before sunset. Harold's grave overlooked a small hill lined with oak trees that turned amber every October. I brought fresh white roses from Mrs. Harper's flower shop and placed them carefully beside the headstone. "You were right," I said quietly while smoothing fallen leaves away from the marble base. "About all of it." Wind moved softly through the trees above me. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang 6 slow notes across the fading light. "I thought Daniel would be different," I admitted. "Maybe he still is. I do not know anymore." Saying it aloud hurt more than I expected. Because beneath all the suspicion and strategy and careful observation sat one terrible truth I had not fully allowed myself to face. My son was changing right in front of me, and I could not tell whether he even realized it. When children are small, you spend years protecting them from dangerous people. Nobody warns you that one day dangerous people may become the ones whispering directly into their ears. I stayed at the cemetery until dusk settled fully over the hill. Then I drove home through quiet streets glowing orange beneath old streetlights. By the time I reached the lake house, exhaustion pressed heavily behind my eyes. But the moment I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The answering machine light was blinking. 3 messages. The first came from St. Anne's reminding volunteers about next week's pantry shift. The second was a telemarketer offering discount roofing estimates. The third made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Whitmore," a male voice said carefully. My name is Brian Keller with Keller Financial Research Group. I apologize for contacting you directly, but I believe you should know someone has been requesting detailed information about your assets and estate planning structures, specifically through connections associated with Leonard Carter. I thought the inquiries seemed unusually persistent. You may want to review your privacy protections. The message ended with a phone number and silence. I stood there in the dark kitchen without moving. Outside, lake water struck softly against the dock in slow rhythmic waves. Then finally I reached over and replayed the message a second time. Persistent. That was the word that stayed with me. Not curious. Not routine. Persistent. They were not simply evaluating me anymore. They were hunting. And suddenly, for the first time since Daniel introduced me to Vanessa nearly a year earlier, I began wondering whether meeting me had ever been accidental at all. I showed up to meet my daughter-in-law's wealthy family wearing a thrift store coat and driving my old Buick. Patricia Carter looked at my shoes and whispered, "Daniel could have done so much better." I smiled like I didn't hear a thing. All through dinner, they treated me like some poor, lonely widow who knew nothing about money. Then I walked back inside to grab my purse and heard Vanessa laugh. "Once Daniel gets his inheritance, we'll never have to work again." They thought I was broke. They thought I was naive. What they didn't know was that my late husband left me ownership of 12 beachfront resorts, and I had been testing them from the very beginning. I drove home that night with the windows cracked open even though the October air was cold enough to sting my hands against the steering wheel. Downtown Chicago glittered in the distance like another world entirely. Expensive restaurants, rooftop bars, glass towers filled with people like Patricia Carter, who believed wealth made them untouchable. The kind of people who mistook elegance for character. My little house sat nearly an hour outside the city near a quiet stretch of lakefront where most tourists never stopped. It was not large by billionaire standards. Just a cedar-sided home tucked behind old maple trees with a wraparound porch and white rocking chairs. Harold insisted on repainting himself every spring. To strangers, it looked comfortable but ordinary. That was intentional. Harold and I spent decades learning how to disappear in plain sight. I turned into the gravel driveway and sat in the car for a long moment after the engine stopped. The porch light glowed softly across the yard. Warm, familiar, safe, but my chest still felt heavy from the things I had overheard. Poor, lonely, naive. I repeated the words silently while staring at the dark water beyond the trees. Strange how easily people reduce you when they believe your life no longer matters. I carried my purse inside and locked the door carefully behind me. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. I had baked apple bread that morning before leaving for the country club, and the scent still lingered in the kitchen. Everything looked exactly as I left it. My reading glasses beside the sink. A half-finished crossword puzzle near the lamp. Harold's favorite navy blanket folded over the couch arm, even though he had not touched it in 4 years. Grief changes shape over time. First it feels like drowning, then eventually it becomes quieter. Like carrying a heavy coat you cannot take off no matter how warm the weather gets. I slipped off my shoes and walked slowly into Harold's study. Most people assumed the room was just storage now. Shelves, old framed photographs, fishing trophies. But hidden behind the built-in cabinets was the control center for nearly everything Harold spent 40 years building. Resort ownership documents, investment portfolios, trust agreements, property deeds from Florida, California, Arizona, and South Carolina. The first time Harold showed me all of it, I laughed because I thought he was being dramatic. "Nobody needs this many folders," I told him. He smiled and said, "The paperwork matters less than the silence around it." Back then I did not fully understand what he meant. I do now. Wealth attracts attention. Attention attracts performance. Some people stop seeing you as human the moment they believe you own something they want. I sat down at the desk and opened the bottom drawer where Harold's leather notebook still rested exactly where he left it. Inside were pages of observations written in his careful block handwriting. Never reveal the full number. Watch how they treat service workers. Listen more than you speak. Generosity without boundaries becomes an invitation to predators. I traced my fingers over the final sentence slowly. Harold wrote that one only a few months before he died. My phone buzzed softly against the desk. "Daniel." I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. "Hi." Sweetheart, I said gently. There was noise behind him. Traffic perhaps. Or maybe the television in their condo. Mom, he said carefully. Did you make it home okay? I did. A pause followed. Small. Uncomfortable. I hope tonight was not too overwhelming, he said. Vanessa's parents can be a little intense sometimes. Intense. That was certainly one way to describe people who evaluated your bank account before deciding whether you deserved respect. They seem very proud of their lifestyle, I replied calmly. Daniel let out a strained laugh. Yeah, Patricia likes appearances. I almost asked him whether appearances mattered to him too. Instead, I walked toward the kitchen window and stared out at the lake. Do you love her? I asked quietly. Silence stretched across the line. Not long. Just long enough to matter. Of course I do, he finally answered. But something about his voice felt rehearsed. Like a man reading from a script he had already repeated to himself too many times. Then that is what matters, I said softly. Another pause. Mom, Vanessa worries about you living out there alone. There it was again. The concern. Always wrapped so neatly. So politely. I managed just fine. I know. It is just... He hesitated. Maybe eventually we should talk about long-term plans. I closed my eyes briefly. Long-term plans. Such harmless words on the surface. But underneath them sat assisted living brochures, property transfers, estate discussions, power of attorney forms. Eventually, I repeated. Not tonight. He exhaled softly. Right. Of course. Get some rest, okay? Good night, Daniel. When the call ended, the house felt even quieter than before. I poured myself a cup of tea and carried it onto the porch. The lake shimmered silver under the moonlight. Somewhere far across the water, a boat engine hummed faintly before disappearing into silence again. Harold used to sit beside me out here every evening. Sometimes we barely spoke for an hour. We just listened to the water and watched the trees move in the wind. People think successful marriages survive because of passion. They survive because of peace. Around midnight, I heard tires crunch against the gravel driveway. I frowned immediately because almost nobody visited unannounced anymore. A black sedan rolled slowly toward the house before stopping near the porch steps. Martin Hayes stepped out wearing his usual charcoal overcoat and carrying a leather folder under one arm. Even at 72, Martin still looked more like a university professor than one of the most feared estate attorneys in Illinois. I apologize for the hour, he said as I opened the front door. But I thought this conversation should happen in person. My stomach tightened slightly. Martin never arrived without reason. I led him into the kitchen and poured fresh coffee while he removed several documents from the folder. You remember the private monitoring system Harold requested before his passing? He asked carefully. The one attached to public financial inquiries? I nodded slowly. Harold established alerts years ago that flagged unusual searches involving our trusts, holding companies, or property structures. At the time, I thought it sounded paranoid. Tonight, I was no longer so sure. Martin adjusted his glasses and slid a paper across the table toward me. 3 weeks ago, someone hired a private financial research firm to investigate assets connected to your name. I stared down at the report. Who? Martin's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened slightly. The request originated through a consulting company owned by Leonard Carter. The kitchen suddenly felt very still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed louder somehow. They are digging quietly, Martin continued. Property estimates, ownership chains, trust structures. They do not know the full picture yet, but they are looking. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Outside, wind rustled through the maple trees along the lake. And Daniel? I asked softly. Do you think he knows? Martin was silent for several seconds before answering. I think your son is in love. Unfortunately, love can make intelligent people overlook dangerous motives. I looked down at my untouched tea. Cold now. Forgotten. They think I am weak, I said quietly. Martin almost smiled. That may turn out to be their biggest mistake. I folded my hands together carefully so he would not notice the slight tremor in them. Because underneath the calmness, underneath the years of practiced composure, something colder had started settling into place inside me. Not anger exactly. Clarity. The kind that arrives too late to save innocence but just in time to protect yourself. For the next several days, I said nothing to Daniel about the phone message or the financial inquiries. I moved through my routines exactly as I always had. Morning coffee on the porch. Grocery shopping on Thursdays. Church pantry volunteer shifts every Friday afternoon. If anyone had looked at me from the outside, they would have seen a quiet widow living a simple life near the lake. That was the advantage of becoming invisible in other people's eyes. They stop imagining you might still be paying attention. Friday afternoon smelled like rain and canned soup inside St. Anne's community pantry. Folding tables lined the hall while volunteers sorted donated food into cardboard boxes for local families. I spent nearly 3 hours organizing pasta and cereal beside Margaret Holloway, who had been my closest friend for over 20 years. Margaret was one of the few people who knew Harold and I had more money than we pretended. Even then, she did not know the full extent of it. "You seem distracted today," she said quietly while stacking canned green beans into neat rows. "I am thinking." She gave me a sideways look over her reading glasses. "That usually means trouble." I smiled faintly. "Do you remember when Daniel first met Vanessa?" Margaret nodded immediately. "At that charity gala downtown. You wore that navy dress Harold loved." I placed another can into the box carefully. I have been replaying that night in my head lately. Because once suspicion enters your life, memories begin rearranging themselves into new shapes. Details you ignored suddenly become impossible to overlook. At the time, I remembered Vanessa as beautiful and polished. The kind of woman who knew exactly how long to hold eye contact and exactly when to laugh during conversations. She approached me before Daniel even introduced us properly. "You must be Eleanor," she said warmly that night. "Daniel talks about you constantly." Most young women meeting their boyfriend's mother ask ordinary questions first. "Where are you from? What did you do for work? How long were you married?" Vanessa asked something different. "Do you still manage all your late husband's affairs yourself?" At the time, I thought she was simply making conversation. Now the memory sat differently, sharper somehow. Margaret handed me another stack of canned vegetables. "You think she targeted him?" she asked softly. I did not answer immediately. Across the room, volunteers laughed quietly while unpacking donated bakery boxes near the entrance. Life moving normally while my thoughts twisted themselves tighter. "I think," I finally said, "that some people study others the way investors study markets." Margaret frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning they look for vulnerability before opportunity." Her expression darkened slightly, but before she could respond, my phone buzzed inside my cardigan pocket. "Daniel, I should take this," I murmured. I stepped outside into the church parking lot where gray clouds hung low over the city. "Hi, sweetheart." "Mom, are we still on for brunch Sunday?" Daniel asked. "Of course." He hesitated. "Vanessa is making that blueberry French toast you like." Such a small detail, thoughtful on the surface. Yet somehow it made my chest ache unexpectedly. Because manipulative people rarely act cruel all the time. If they did, nobody would stay close to them long enough to be harmed. "That sounds wonderful," I replied softly. "Good." Another pause followed. Then his voice lowered slightly. "Mom, have you thought any more about maybe moving closer to us eventually?" There it was again. Gentle pressure wrapped inside concern. "I like the lake house." "I know. It is just isolated. I have neighbors." "You are 70 years old." The words landed quietly between us. Not harsh, not angry, just factual. And somehow that hurt more. Because for the first time in my life, I heard my son speaking to me less like family and more like responsibility. "I am 68, I corrected gently. He laughed awkwardly. "Right. Sorry." But the correction did not matter. The number itself was not the point. Age had become part of the narrative now. Elderly. Vulnerable. Alone. Easier to guide. Easier to reposition. Easier to manage. "We will talk Sunday," I said calmly. "All right. Love you, Mom." "Love you too." When the call ended, I remained standing beneath the cloudy sky for several seconds before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Across the parking lot, Margaret watched me carefully through the church doorway. She knew me well enough to recognize when silence meant more than words. That evening after I returned home, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed and removed several old photo albums. Dust drifted through the air as I carried them downstairs and spread them across the coffee table. Sometimes the past reveals things the present tries to hide. In one photograph, Daniel sat on Harold's shoulders at Disney World wearing mouse ears too large for his tiny head. In another, he grinned beside his first fishing catch at age 9 while Harold pretended the tiny bluegill was a shark. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, science fair ribbons, soccer trophies, thousands of ordinary moments stitched together into motherhood. I turned pages slowly while rain tapped against the windows again. Then eventually I reached photographs from Daniel's engagement party last spring. Vanessa stood beside him in a pale gold dress, smiling perfectly into the camera. Patricia Carter stood nearby wearing diamonds and champagne-colored silk. Leonard had one arm draped casually across Daniel's shoulder, already as if claiming ownership. I studied the photographs carefully. Not the poses, the positioning. Vanessa always leaning slightly toward Daniel while watching me from the corner of her eye. Patricia standing close whenever conversations turned financial or practical. Leonard paying unusually careful attention whenever property or travel came up. Patterns. Tiny ones. But once seen, impossible to ignore. My gaze settled on one particular photo taken near sunset outside the ballroom terrace. I stood beside Vanessa holding a wineglass while she smiled brightly at the camera. But Leonard was visible in the background looking directly at me. Not warmly, not affectionately, calculating. The same way real estate developers inspect waterfront property before deciding its value. A cold feeling moved slowly through my chest, because suddenly another memory surfaced with startling clarity. 2 weeks after the engagement, Vanessa insisted on helping me organize paperwork at the lake house after I mentioned struggling to locate Harold's old insurance documents. She spent nearly 4 hours in my study that afternoon while I prepared lunch in the kitchen. At the time I thought she was trying to bond with me. Now I wondered what exactly she had been searching for while my back was turned. My thoughts were interrupted by headlights sweeping across the front windows. A car pulled into the driveway. I frowned because nobody visited unexpectedly this late except Margaret. But when I opened the front door, Daniel stood there alone in the cold evening air wearing a dark wool coat and an exhausted expression. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said quietly. "You never interrupt." He stepped inside slowly, glancing toward the photo albums spread across the coffee table. "Wow," he murmured softly. "I forgot about some of these." I watched him carefully while he removed his coat. He looked tired, older somehow than his 38 years. Stress sat heavily around his eyes. "Vanessa did not come?" I asked. "She had dinner with her parents." Something in his tone felt off. Subtle, but present. I carried the albums back toward the table while he wandered into the kitchen. "Coffee?" I offered. "Please." While the machine brewed, silence settled softly between us. Comfortable once, uncertain now. Then finally Daniel spoke without looking at me. "Vanessa thinks you do not like her family." I stirred cream into his coffee slowly. "Do you?" He gave a short, uneasy laugh. "Mom, it is a fair question." He leaned against the counter and rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Patricia can be superficial sometimes, but they mean well. Mean well." Funny how often people defend bad behavior with those two words. I handed him the coffee mug carefully. "Do you know what your father used to say about wealthy people?" Daniel shook his head. "He used to say the truly dangerous ones are never loud about it." Daniel looked down into his coffee. "What does that mean?" I studied my son quietly for several seconds before answering. "It means some people smile while they are measuring what you are worth to them." For the briefest moment, something flickered across Daniel's face. Recognition, perhaps. Or fear. But it vanished almost immediately. And deep down, I realized something that frightened me far more than Leonard Carter or Patricia's greed ever could. My son was beginning to notice the cracks too. The first snowfall arrived 3 days before Thanksgiving. Thin white flakes drifted across the lake while I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing coffee cups I had not really used. The house felt quieter lately. Not peaceful quiet. Suspended quiet. Like the moment before ice cracks beneath your feet. Daniel had not called since the argument in my kitchen, though Vanessa continued sending cheerful text messages every morning as if nothing uncomfortable had happened between us. Good morning, Eleanor. Stay warm today. Thinking of you. Tiny performances delivered with perfect consistency. The strange thing about manipulative people is how disciplined they become once they believe the prize is close enough to touch. Around noon, Margaret stopped by carrying a pot of homemade soup wrapped carefully in towels. You look tired, she said the moment I opened the door. I stepped aside so she could come in out of the cold. I have been thinking too much. That usually means you are close to making a decision. I smiled faintly because she knew me too well. We sat at the kitchen table while snow gathered softly along the porch railing outside. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee and studied me quietly. You still have not told Daniel the truth, have you? I looked down at my hands. No, why? The answer should have been simple. Because I wanted to protect myself. Because Harold spent decades building systems designed for exactly this situation. Because Leonard Carter was circling our family like a starving man staring through bakery windows. But the real answer sat somewhere deeper than logic. Because once I say it aloud, I whispered, I will know for certain whether my son loves me or only the version of me he thinks exists. Margaret's expression softened slightly. You really believe Daniel would turn against you for money? No, I paused briefly. I believe fear changes people. Pressure changes people. And love mixed with manipulation becomes something dangerous. Snow tapped softly against the windows while silence settled between us again. Then Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. Harold trusted your instincts for a reason. After she left, I spent most of the afternoon upstairs in Harold's study reviewing old trust documents Martin had prepared years earlier. Layer after layer of protections sat hidden beneath boring legal language most people would never fully understand. Resort holdings buried inside private partnerships. Coastal properties shielded by succession clauses. Family trusts with strict inheritance conditions. Harold designed everything carefully after watching his own brother lose nearly $8 million during a bitter divorce decades ago. Never confuse access with ownership, he told me once while organizing paperwork late one night. And never assume blood protects people from greed. At the time I thought he sounded harsh. Now his caution felt almost prophetic. Around 4 o'clock my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa. Family dinner tonight at our place. Patricia and Leonard are coming too. Daniel really wants you there. I stared at the screen for several seconds. The timing felt deliberate. Another coordinated gathering. Another opportunity to apply pressure gently beneath the surface of conversation. I almost declined, but avoidance only delays truth. By 6:30, downtown Chicago glowed beneath fresh snow while I rode the elevator toward Daniel's condo carrying a homemade pecan pie balanced carefully in my hands. Vanessa opened the door smiling brightly. Eleanor, that smells amazing. Warm lighting filled the apartment while Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers. Patricia sat near the fireplace wearing emerald silk and diamonds that flashed every time she lifted her wineglass. Leonard stood beside the window speaking quietly with Daniel about something business-related. Everyone looked polished, comfortable, controlled. There she is, Patricia announced warmly. We were just discussing holiday plans. I handed Vanessa the pie while removing my coat. I hope nobody is tired of pecan yet. Never, Daniel said quickly, finally approaching to hug me. But even during the embrace, tension sat visibly across his shoulders. He looked exhausted again, thinner somehow than only a month earlier. During dinner, conversation stayed deceptively pleasant at first. Holiday travel, winter weather, wedding invitations. But gradually the familiar pattern emerged once more. Patricia discussing retirement communities near Naples. Leonard mentioning estate taxes. Vanessa bringing up practical planning for future transitions. Each topic landed carefully closer to me than the last. Then halfway through dinner, Patricia set down her wineglass and smiled across the table. You know, Eleanor, I spoke with a wonderful woman this week who moved into a luxury senior community after her husband passed. She said it completely transformed her life. I cut slowly into my salmon without looking up. That sounds nice for her. The best part, Patricia continued smoothly, was finally letting go of the burden of maintaining property alone. Burden. Another strategic word. I took a sip of water. Some people find purpose in caring for the places they love. Leonard leaned back in his chair. Still, there comes a point where practicality matters more than sentiment. Daniel shifted beside me uncomfortably but said nothing. And suddenly, more than Leonard's comment or Patricia's false concern, that silence hurt the most. Because my son was beginning to allow conversations about my future to happen as though I were no longer fully present inside them. Vanessa smiled softly toward me. We just want you to feel supported, managed, relocated, gradually separated from independence, while everyone congratulated themselves for kindness. I folded my napkin carefully onto my lap. You are all very thoughtful. Patricia smiled immediately, encouraged. Again by my calmness. Actually, she continued lightly, Leonard knows an excellent financial advisor who specializes in helping older women simplify their estates. There it was, finally moving closer to the center. Leonard nodded casually, especially widows who may not fully understand complex holdings. Daniel looked down at his plate. He did not defend me, did not challenge the implication, just sat there quietly while another man suggested I was incapable of understanding my own life. Something cold settled deeper inside me then. Not anger anymore. Clarity. Pure and steady. Because suddenly I realized they had all made the same fatal mistake. They believed kindness meant ignorance. They believed age meant weakness. They believed silence meant surrender. Dinner ended shortly afterward. Vanessa carried dessert plates into the kitchen while Patricia followed her. Leonard disappeared onto the balcony with Daniel again, their voices muffled behind glass doors streaked with snow. I remained alone at the dining table for several quiet seconds, staring at candlelight reflected across polished silverware. Then I stood slowly and carried empty coffee cups toward the kitchen. I stopped before entering when I heard Vanessa speaking softly inside. She is even easier to influence than we thought. Patricia laughed quietly. Of course she is. Lonely women cling to anyone who gives them attention. My fingers tightened around the coffee cups. Vanessa lowered her voice further. Once Daniel convinces her to transfer management authority, everything else becomes simple. And if she resists? Patricia asked. A short pause followed before Vanessa answered calmly. Then we push harder after the wedding. Silence filled my chest so suddenly it almost felt physical. Transfer management authority. They were not just circling inheritance anymore. They wanted control while I was still alive. Another voice interrupted before I could process the thought fully. Daniels. Close now. Approaching the kitchen from the balcony. What are you two talking about? Vanessa answered instantly, her tone sweet and effortless again. Christmas plans. I stepped backward quietly before anyone noticed me standing there. Then I placed the coffee cups carefully onto the hallway table because my hands had started trembling for the first time since this entire nightmare began. Not from fear. From heartbreak. Because hidden beneath all the greed and manipulation and quiet calculation sat one terrible truth I could no longer avoid. My son was standing in the middle of something ugly, and he still did not understand how close it was to destroying him. The morning after Thanksgiving dinner, I woke before sunrise with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with age or exhaustion. Outside, snow covered the dock in smooth, untouched layers while pale blue light spread slowly across the frozen lake. I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee gone cold in my hands and replayed Vanessa's words over and over again. Once Daniel convinces her to transfer management authority, everything else becomes simple. Simple. The word itself felt almost cruel. As if dismantling someone's independence was no more complicated than rearranging furniture. Around 8 o'clock, Martin arrived carrying 2 thick folders tucked beneath one arm. He removed his coat carefully while glancing toward me with the quiet concern people reserve for bad news they are trying to soften. You did not sleep much, he observed. Neither did you, judging by those folders. A faint smile touched his mouth before disappearing again. We sat in Harold's study while snow drifted steadily beyond the windows. Martin spread documents across the desk one by one with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. I hired additional investigators after your call last night, he said calmly. There is more happening beneath the surface than we initially realized. My stomach tightened slightly. How much more? Martin adjusted his glasses. Leonard Carter recently attempted to secure a private investment loan using projected inheritance expectations connected indirectly to Daniel. The room seemed to go completely silent for a moment. Inheritance expectations? I repeated softly, meaning he presented financial projections based on what he assumes Daniel will eventually control. I stared down at the papers in front of me without really seeing them. Numbers blurred together beneath my fingertips. That is not even legal. It is not entirely illegal either, Martin replied carefully. Predatory, reckless, but technically framed as anticipated future family assets. Future family assets. They were already spending money they believed would someday become theirs. Harold's voice echoed sharply in my memory then. Never tell people how much you have unless you are willing to watch them calculate your death like a business opportunity. I closed my eyes briefly. Does Daniel know about this? Martin hesitated. That hesitation alone told me enough. I cannot prove he knows the details, he finally answered. But his signature appears on at least one preliminary financial disclosure connected to Leonard's loan applications. Something inside me cracked quietly at those words. Not loudly. Not dramatically, just a small clean break deep beneath years of motherhood and trust. Because my son may not have understood the full manipulation surrounding him, but he had started participating in it nonetheless. Martin slid another document across the desk toward me. There is more. I looked down slowly. It was a draft proposal for a post-marriage financial restructuring agreement. My name appeared several times throughout the pages. So did Daniel's. And Vanessa's. My pulse slowed into something dangerously calm. What exactly am I looking at? A preliminary strategy, Martin said quietly. If you were persuaded to transfer asset management assistance to Daniel after the wedding, Leonard intended to position himself as a financial consultant overseeing restructuring of your estate holdings. I almost laughed then. Not from amusement. From disbelief at how methodical greed can become once people convince themselves they deserve access to your life. They built an entire future around taking control of things they do not even understand. I whispered. Martin studied me carefully. What would you like to do? Outside, snow continued falling softly across the lake while silence filled Harold's study. For a long moment I said nothing at all. Then finally I stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the water. Harold used to say people reveal their truest selves when they think nobody is watching, I murmured quietly. I spent months pretending to be harmless, and they spent months proving him right. Martin waited patiently behind me. I think it is time to stop pretending, I said at last. That afternoon, I drove into Chicago for a wedding planning luncheon Vanessa had insisted I attend weeks earlier. The restaurant overlooked Michigan Avenue with enormous crystal chandeliers hanging above white linen tables. Everything smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Patricia greeted me with her usual polished warmth while several women I did not recognize sat nearby discussing centerpiece options and honeymoon destinations. Eleanor, Patricia exclaimed brightly. We were just talking about rehearsal dinner venues. I removed my coat slowly before taking my seat. I am sure Vanessa will choose something beautiful. The women around the table smiled politely, though I noticed several of them glanced discreetly toward my simple clothes and modest handbag. Patricia had likely already introduced me exactly the way she preferred. Daniel's sweet but aging mother from the lake house. Comfortable enough. Harmless enough. One of Patricia's friends leaned toward me with a practiced social smile. Vanessa says you used to teach elementary school. 3rd grade, I replied. For 32 years. That is adorable, the woman said. Adorable. Another word wealthy people sometimes use when they want to make your life sound small enough not to threaten them. Lunch arrived shortly afterward. Tiny salads arranged like artwork. Sparkling water in thin crystal glasses. Quiet jazz drifting through hidden speakers again. Across the table, Patricia discussed wedding expenses loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Honestly, luxury weddings today can easily reach 6 figures, she sighed dramatically. But some experiences are worth investing in properly. I cut slowly into my salad without reacting. Then Patricia turned toward me with false sympathy carefully arranged across her face. Of course not. Everyone understands those kinds of budgets. Several women laughed softly into their wine glasses. Tiny social cruelty disguised as humor. I felt something inside me settle completely still then. Not wounded anymore. Finished. Because suddenly I saw the entire situation with perfect clarity. Patricia Carter did not simply look down on me. She needed to. My smallness made her feel secure. My supposed ignorance allowed her to believe she controlled the room. And Vanessa had learned the exact same behavior. People who build identities around status panic whenever they encounter quiet strength they cannot immediately measure. You are absolutely right, I said softly. Patricia smiled triumphantly. I knew you would understand. Harold and I never enjoyed flashy spending, I continued calmly. Though I suppose perspective changes after years of managing luxury resort properties. The entire table went silent. Forks paused halfway through salads. Patricia blinked once. I am sorry, she said carefully. I lifted my water glass casually. The coastal resorts Harold purchased years ago. Florida mostly. A few in California. They became rather successful after retirement. No one moved. No one spoke. I almost felt sorry for them then. Almost. Patricia recovered first, though her smile looked strained now around the edges. I had no idea your husband worked in hospitality. Most people did not. I held her gaze calmly across the table. Harold believed privacy protected families better than money ever could. Another silence followed, sharper this time. Around us, restaurant noise continued normally while tension gathered thickly at our table like approaching weather. Patricia set down her wineglass very carefully. Well, she said slowly, that certainly sounds impressive. Impressive. Interesting how quickly language changes once value enters the room. I smiled politely and reached for my purse. Please excuse me. I promised Daniel I would stop by his office afterward. As I stood, I noticed something I had not seen once since meeting the Carter family. Fear. Real fear. Not because of my wealth itself. Because in one quiet sentence I had shifted the balance of power. They thought they understood. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Patricia Carter no longer looked at me like prey.